Hey folks, welcome back to another episode of Important Info. Brothers and sisters, this story is a great one. It is about my journey of sexual abuse at the hands of a loved one and authority figure, how it affected me, how I overcame it, and what I am still doing today, every day, to overcome it. So I will start by telling you that I began diving at the age of 11. And when I began diving, the head coach of the team was a figure of authority and somebody to look up to. The head coach of the team had all the best divers in it. And so naturally, as a young kid, watching the older athletes train, that was the group that ultimately I was working to get into. And the leader of that group was this coach. So as and even as I make this podcast, I question whether or not to mention his name. But I think for the sake that I hope this man heals from his own afflictions, and this video doesn't stigmatize him or follow him around like a old dirty rag, I will not mention his name. But I will continue on with the story. So, when I joined diving, many of my peers in this sport had been training for even 6 years earlier than me. They began the sport 6 years earlier than me. And so I recognize that I've got to try really hard. I got to work really hard to get to where these guys are. And that emphasis on working extra hard allowed me to, within a few years, become a provincial medalist and champion, and within a few years more, a national champion at the junior level, and within about maybe 4 or 5 years, I was in this group that I wanted to be in when I had originally started in the sport. I was in the group that had the head coach of the national team. After training in this group for a few years, the relationship that was built between me and the coach was a bond of father and son. As my father had died when I was 2 weeks old, I always had a longing deep inside of me to find a father figure of some kind in this world. And I had never really found one until this coach showed an immense amount of love for me in my life. We spent 7 hours a day training nearly every day for the sport, and outside of the sport, he would help me with life advice, financial help here and there, and ultimately, we were traveling around the world, killing competitions together, winning championships on every continent. And so the bond that we built was a real awesome bond. I came to love this man like my father. Now, one competition, which took place in Montreal, was where the sexual abuse first happened. Now, when it came time to book hotels, if there was ever an odd number of male athletes, as each hotel room normally has 2 beds, if there was an odd number of male athletes, I would get booked in the same room as my coach, because he was like my dad and I didn't mind, and it was cool. Everybody had their own bed. It was all good. After this particular competition had finished and we were still in the city, the coach asked me and some of the other underage athletes if we wanted to go out and celebrate with the other athletes. And because this was a senior national championships, most of the competitors were adults. But because me and some of the other athletes were good enough to be competing at a higher level with the adults, we were at this competition. So after the competition, the athletes, they go out and they celebrate. And of course, we wanted to be a part of that celebration. So when it came time to go to the nightclub where all the athletes were going to enjoy their celebrations, the coach greased the bouncers, paid to get us in the back door, and we were in having the time of our lives. Music, dancing, drinking, all these things that perhaps were a little too mature for somebody my age. And by the end of the night, I was so drunk that I could not even walk. I don't even remember getting to the hotel room. I barely remember leaving the nightclub. And it was my coach who was buying me all this alcohol, as I wasn't really funded. I had no income of any kind, being a age group national team athlete. So the next memory that I have after stumbling out of the bar is waking up to my coach sucking my penis. And it is a very dark memory. It's just waking up in the hotel bed, and I recognize that this is going on. And it is so shocking and traumatic for me, and I try to kick, and I try to scream, and I try to fight, but I can't even move. And I don't know if that's because I was drugged, or if the drug of alcohol itself and the amount that was in my system and the lack of experience with alcohol, that may have been enough to debilitate me to the point where I couldn't even move or say anything. So I passed back out right away. And when I woke up that next morning, I immediately confronted him with, how could you do this? Why would you do this? What the heck were you thinking? And then knock, knock, knock on the hotel room door, and I open it up, and it's all the hungover athletes who are like, hey, come on guys, let's go get something to eat. So I didn't really have a lot of time to confront it right away. And being 17 years old, a national champion, ego, so to speak, or a idea of who I am, and the idea that somebody else would know that this had happened, it was the worst thing that could happen. I mean, it's such an unhealthy and dysfunctional thing to happen, that for anybody to know that it had happened was, my biggest fear in the world. So what did I do? I completely pretended like it didn't happen around everybody else and continued on as the happy, healthy national team athlete that I was. Now, when we got back to Victoria, I confronted my coach again, and we went to Subway and got something to eat, and I talked to him about it. And to be honest with you, at this point, I had about 6 years of interaction with him. 2 and 3 of those years were very close, successful, loving interactions where we were traveling around the world, where no boundaries had been crossed. So there was a lot of emotional momentum and trust and love for this guy. And during this confrontation, he promised me that not only was he drunk as well and, out of control and very apologetic, and he also promised that it would never happen again. I actually fully forgave him. I really did. This guy was like my father, and people do make mistakes. So I forgave him. So with this forgiving of that original misconduct, we continued on as, what was I going to do? I had been training in this sport for about 7 years. I was the guy to go to the Olympics. And, what other option did I have at that point? My life experience was so limited that there was no ideas of even how to do anything else in life other than dive. When I thought about myself, I know I'm a national team diver. That's who I am. And so to compromise that in any way is just not going to happen. So that's a real lesson in self-interest, and how our own self-interest can sometimes give us tunnel vision and not allow us to seek other paths. And from where I am today, if I ever experience negativity or dysfunction on that level in whatever I'm doing now, I simply figure something out, do something else. I have to. It doesn't matter the financial pressures, the personal pressures of family, friends, or loved ones, whatever it is. Seek a different path, because that type of dysfunction is not something that anybody deserves to go through, especially if it's dysfunction being put on you from somebody else. So, as I continued my training regime of about 6 to 7 hours every day except Sunday, I continued on in a great way. I went on to place third at a Junior World Championships, and everything continued on marvelously until 9 months later, nearly the same experience happened again. And the difference between the first experience and the second experience was the second experience, I woke up the next morning and I said, Wagadesk, how could you let this happen to yourself? He did this to you once and he tricked you. You're so stupid. And I lost all trust in myself. And that's the biggest difference and the most important aspect to recognize about trauma, whether it's experiencing someone else's trauma that affects you so personally, or if you personally experience the trauma yourself on a very deep level, we lose the conviction that we can protect ourselves. Because obviously, if this super bad thing happens, I must not be able to protect myself. So my self-confidence plummeted. And on the other hand, I was still a national team athlete. I was still the guy to go to the Olympics. And I had to upkeep that persona because what did I have left? So by the time the second abuse occurred, I was 18. And there was still 2 years to go until the Olympics. And my God, I was so invested in making the Olympics after everything that I had done in my career. National championships in Canada, Australia, South Africa, just so much success that the only thing I hadn't done in the sport was go to the Olympics. So I kept that view and I kept that goal, and I would show up every day and train under this coach. 7 hours of this guy telling me what to do when I knew what a bad person he was. Now, as life would have it, my home life was also very dysfunctional at the time. There was a lot of anger and dysfunction in my home because in my family, everybody in my family is still getting over the abuses perpetrated on Aboriginal people and our ancestors in North America through things like the residential school. And that was put on us by the Canadian government, the Crown Corporation actually, and the church. And the trauma was so serious that it can follow a person down their genetic bloodline. And so there was a lot of dysfunction. My family's actually doing amazingly well now, thank goodness. But at that point, my house life was so chaotic that I had to move out of my house because the violence there was unbearable. Can you imagine training for 7 hours with this guy who'd sexually abused you and then coming home and then things get worse? Like, wow. So, I had to move out. I had to move out of the house where my family was, and the only place that I had to move in with was with this man who was my only support. And that's a really important acknowledgement to make, is that a huge part of his culturing process was to dissolve my supports over the years and years that I knew him. It was a slow corruption through rumors and negativity about, oh yeah, your mom's so stupid, and oh yeah, your family, you can't trust your family, and oh, your friends are talking bad about you. And coming from a loved one, I trusted this guy, and at the end of the day, as those things are coming in, they're not a big deal. But over years and years and years, those relationships that you have with those people all essentially were diminished to the point where